most of us have a moment. Or perhaps, if we're perceptive enough, many moments over the course of our career where we shift from the concept of individual achievement to that of contribution. In a way, it's like seeing ourselves standing in a spotlight versus holding a candle with a single flame. You see, the power that a flame offers is that you only need one to light thousands more. And spotlights, well, they don't exactly work the same way. As I look back over the first decade of my professional career, it was almost always about standing in a spotlight of my own making. A race I had to win, a mountain I had to climb. After all, I had been told by my parents and grandparents, teachers and coaches that I can do anything. Think of my focus like a rubber band that wraps about behind my neck to the backs of both of my hands. Graduate college in 3 years so I can get out and make money. It's all about me. Once I have my first real job, what goals could I exceed next? It's all about me. Now, how can I improve my credibility and visibility in my company and in my industry? Again, ding, all about me. And all jokes aside, this mindset served me well in many ways, until it didn't. And that's what brings me here today. Because what makes my experience worth sharing is the vehicle I learned to build and leverage, intentional peer groups focused on professional development, which I call developmental cohorts, because they focus on sharing best practices and encouraging mutual development for all involved. As young professionals, we have this internal tug of war. Pulling on one side of the rope is my desire for a safe space of vulnerability and honesty, where I have to start as a young person because, well, I don't know anything yet. But pulling just as fiercely over here is my desperate need to prove my credibility and my competence, which, by the way, I always equated with age and experience, which is why I consistently lied about my age, and I was 28 for 5 years. But despite that pulling and pulling, when I finally first stood in a spotlight of my own making, I was scared. You see, I wasn't entirely sure how I got there or how to replicate it. And I was definitely scared I wasn't good enough to sustain it. So if this sounds a little like you, my invitation to my fellow millennials in the audience is to share my simple 3-step process, learn from that experience, and help you create your own peer group or developmental cohort, and then leverage it for the benefit of all involved. Because the theme of this TED event is what's next. And I say we double down and say, who's next? We are. And as a millennial, I like my infographics, but I thought it would be a little fun to go old school today and draw them myself. So the demographics in the United States is not unlike a barbell. We have 63 million boomers, and at the other end, weighted down very heavily, is us, 80 million millennials. And that skinny little bar in between, that's Gen X. So what this means is that succession planning and talent are big issues inside our organizations, because our companies are going to have to pipeline young leaders into leadership positions before we're really ready. And organizations know this and are genuinely trying to address the problem. I know this because they hire coaches like me to come and help them. And from the Fortune 500 to the family-owned business down the street, they're floundering as they struggle to adapt their traditional developmental models, like formal one-on-one mentoring with some executive who doesn't have time for this but needs to check a box. Or our favorite as a generation, death by PowerPoint training classes. So contrast that corporate university type model to our unique, informal, collaborative learning style. We want to learn exactly what we need to know as we need to know it. Think about it. If I have a question, I'll post it on Facebook and get 25 responses within minutes, tailored to me. Twitter will give me hundreds more. Still not fast enough? Google takes 2.3 seconds. And while previous generations grew up in classrooms with row after row of desks, we started learning in pods of 4 or 5 kids in kindergarten. If you think about it, we've always learned in a peer group. So, back to our barbell. Raise your hand if you're a boomer, born before 1964. Raise them up. So, demographers tell us that in the workplace, you value process, procedure, and program. I'm seeing some heads nodding in the audience, right? How else can you ensure that things are going to get done? Now, raise your hand if you're a Gen Xer, born between 1964 and 1977. Well, demographers tell us that you value individuality in the workplace, meaning, tell me what needs to get done, don't tell me how to get there. Now raise your hand if you're a millennial, born after 1977. Guess what, folks? We don't learn like either previous generation, but we live in companies being run by both. So if I need professional development, the typical corporate response is, oh, we have a class for that in the spring. Or, let's assign you a mentor so you can build a relationship, which is kind of like my parents assigning me a boyfriend. But that said, no apologies, no blame. This is not about us versus them, nor is it about what should be, because I promise you our organizations are trying to address this. But today, instead, is about how we can leverage our learning style to help our organizations pipeline us successfully. Because as millennials, after all, we want and need this just as much as they. By 2020, 50% of the workforce will be made up of millennial talent. 50%. And in the past, where we had 9 levels in the traditional career path, right? Entry level for 4, and then a supervisor for 2, and then a manager, and a director, and a VP, which took on average 14 years. Well, we don't have that kind of time anymore. Look at our barbell. We'd be lucky if we have 7. So knowing that, our challenge today, folks, is that we have half the time to get ourselves ready for leadership in our organizations, in our industries, and in our communities. Because this is a complex global problem, and it's not our companies, nor is it ours alone to solve, but we can choose to own our part in solving it. After all, a flame loses nothing in lighting another. The first time I realized I had this choice was in my early 20s. Since college, I've had 6 different jobs and 2 entirely different careers. And my first career, I was a surgical equipment sales, and I was a good enough sales rep that I got to develop new hires in my local region. And I loved it. After a few short years, I assumed that this must be what management is all about, right? Developing people. So in my naive 24-year-old mind, I decided I should be a sales manager. So hear me when I say that I was successful in convincing my company that with 0 management experience, I would be a great sales manager. And it didn't even take me a year to go down in flames. Because the very qualities that made me a good sales rep made me at best a C- sales manager. And I saw this later in my career in the construction industry, right? That what makes someone an A+ engineer does not necessarily make him or her a great manager of engineers. But I never forgot that experience. Was it the company's fault? That they should have had better training programs? Or was it mine? That I had sold them something I didn't have the ability to deliver on? And I'd say, it's a little bit of both of ours to own. I've been in the organization and leadership development space ever since, spending many of those years as an executive in the construction industry, where I worked my way up inside a general contractor to become their first female vice president. And I reached that level because A, I realized I didn't know it all. And B, that I knew I needed professional development. And not just programmatic development, but a process to take charge of my career. And so I got together with some of my peers. And through our collaboration, we started to realize that what we face as emerging leaders and what we think is individual to us is really a part of a collective experience. And together we co-created our first developmental cohort. So a cohort is a group of people in a similar developmental space meeting on a regular and consistent basis to share best practices, what works and what doesn't. It is not a group of friends. You have that already. Instead, it's an intentional group of peers who can be inside your organization or out, but intent to move each person's career forward. And the reason that it works is because the process is ridiculously simple. We meet monthly and we share success, challenge, need for support. Meaning, in the last 30 days since we've been together, what's been your greatest success? What's the challenge you're facing right now? And how can we help? I was exposed to this process called a mastermind, and it immediately resonated with me because it placed me as a millennial comfortably back with my peers. The order is intentional, and what I found profound about it is that it always ended with the need for support, meaning that we got to practice asking for help regularly. And it incorporated a positive starting point, celebrating successes, because A, we don't do that often enough, and B, how else do we know who has the experience we need to call on when we find ourselves in trouble? And after a few years of building and participating in informal cohort learning, we recognized that peer mentoring has an inherent limitation. You see, as young people, we don't know what we don't know. And the answer to that is easy, mentoring. But not necessarily the kind of mentoring that worked so well in the past for the program-focused boomers or the individual-respecting Gen Xers, but topic-based mentoring with many people. As millennials, we don't want one mentor to be our be-all and end-all when I can have many guest mentors in my life. We experience the power of learning in groups. Why not mentoring? One of my favorite guest mentor stories involves a leader named Jean, who met with a cohort of us and shared that 23 years earlier, she had taken on a role that had direct P&L accountability, meaning a vice president role, but without the title to match. So not wanting to make waves, and because of office politics at the time, Jean didn't push for the title. She shared with us that decades later, she still found herself explaining to people that that role was technically a vice president's role. Of the 19 young people in the room that day, 6 went back to their organization and negotiated new title changes within 90 days. What I want you to hear is that 6 millennials asked and all 6 received. Because that day, over breakfast, Jean lit 6 candles. And I've seen over and over that this developmental model is sustainable because it's based on leveraging the best practices of individuals to ignite and inspire others. And the good news is, if I can do this, so can you. I've spent the last 7 years building and facilitating cohorts across the country and mentoring other young people to do the same. And we're now reaching a point where they are mentoring others. It's kind of like a movement. So I want to leave you today with 3 simple steps to start your own cohort. And it begins with a triangle, a fire triangle. So I'm a lifelong Girl Scout. And if there are any scouts in the room, you know it is a badge of honor to create a 2-minute fire or a 1-match fire. And I can do both. So I believe this totally qualifies me to share this fire building best practice with you. So fire needs 3 elements. It needs air to breathe, fuel, to burn and heat to continue burning. Well, and it's the same with cohort learning. First, we need our peers. Like the air we breathe as a generation, we can't exist as successfully without them as we can with them. And as millennials who value collaboration and contribution, our best learning development happens when our opportunities are seated in both. Second, we need consistency. Meeting monthly and following a format like success, challenge, need for support, well, that's the fuel that ignites our fire. It's when we hold each other accountable to own our personal and professional development. And third, when the cohort is gelled and trust is built, we add in this element of heat through guest mentors. Guest mentors who challenge us, who ask the tough questions, who provide a little friction. Because the commonality across all the generations is that our best learning happens when we're a little uncomfortable. And it takes all three elements to burn. And when they do, you have synergistic combustion. But if you take one element away, air, fuel, heat, the flame dies. Peers, consistency, guest mentors. Simple in form, but complex in combination. And this message is not just for millennials, but Gen X and boomers too. Because in closing, my hope for our time together today was to ignite a new conversation, a new possibility of learning for you. Because we don't need to wait for our organizations to build us another training class or assign us a mentor. We have a choice to meet them halfway. We have a choice to engage with the generations before us and the generations after us and contribute to our organizations. And because the glow from a single candle allows me to see what's directly in front of me, but the power of many will light up a room. And in a room full of light, we no longer feel alone.